widowed at 19 with 3 small mouths and no land. A Lakota chief gave her ground in his name. The first thing I remember her saying to me, the first real thing, not the thank you that a frightened woman says to whoever pulls her out of the cold, was that she didn't want charity. She said it while she was still holding the littlest one against her chest. February. The wind off the ridge had been cutting for 3 days, and her lips were cracked down the middle, and she hadn't eaten since she'd left the settlement. I could see that without being told. The child in her arms was quiet in the way that children go quiet when they've given up crying and just wait. The other 2 were behind her, a boy of maybe 5 and a girl a year older, standing in the snow with their eyes down like they'd been taught not to look at me. She said she didn't want charity, and she lifted her chin when she said it, even with the cold and the fear and whatever had come before I found her. I didn't say anything. I turned and walked back toward the fire, and after a moment I heard her feet in the snow behind me. That was the beginning. I should tell you what I was then because it matters to the rest of it. I was 41. My wife had been gone 11 years, caught fever the summer after my son was born, and my son went with her, 2 days after. 11 years is long enough that the grief doesn't knock you down anymore. It just sits in you like a stone you've learned to carry. You don't feel it every hour. You feel it when you reach for something that isn't there. My people called me Chayton, Swift Hawk. I had been a chief for 6 years by then, which sounds larger than it feels. Mostly it means you carry other people's trouble until your back gets used to the weight. I had 47 people in my band that winter, and I knew every one of them by the sound of their breathing. I knew who was getting sick and who was carrying a child and whose horses needed watching. The trail we moved along wasn't mine to own. No trail is, but I knew where the game moved and where the water ran under the ice and which ridges cut the worst of the wind. That was my job, knowing things so other people didn't have to. I found her 3 miles from where we'd camped on the near side of a frozen creek bed. Her wagon was tipped, one wheel cracked through to the axle. Her husband, I learned later he'd been dead 4 days, taken by his own horse, the animal spooked by something in the dark and his boot caught in the stirrup. She'd buried him herself in the ground she could get to with the one tool she had left, a short-handled spade, and then she'd turned west because west was the only direction that didn't close. She had no map. She had flour and a little dried pork and 3 children, and she was walking. I brought them to camp and gave them the warmest place by the fire, and said nothing to my people about what it meant or what I planned. Crow Feather, he'd ridden with me since we were young men. He watched me and didn't ask. She slept that first night sitting up with the children against her. I sat on the other side of the fire, and I didn't sleep much, and I didn't think about anything in particular. I just watched the fire and listened to the wind work on the edges of the shelter, and now and then I looked at her. Her name was Clara Marsh, though that name was about to stop meaning what it had. She had dark hair going lighter at the temples from being out in the weather, and her eyes were brown and direct, the kind of eyes that had been cried dry a long time ago and weren't going to do it again in front of anyone. She was 19. I learned that later too. 19, 3 children, a dead husband, a cracked wagon, and the better part of February still to go. In the morning I gave her food and she fed the children first, which told me something. When they were done she ate what was left, which told me more. I said, "You can stay until the weather breaks." She looked at me without flinching, which most people didn't do. She said, "And then?" I didn't have an answer for that yet. I said, "Then we'll see." That was not a satisfying answer. She knew that and I knew that, but it was honest, and I think she'd had enough of things that weren't honest to know the difference. The boy's name was Thomas. He was 5, going on 50, the kind of quiet, watchful stillness that you see in boys who have seen too much too fast. He watched me from the first morning with a level gaze that was almost rude, the way a child stares before anyone's told them not to. I let him. I was being measured. That's fair. By the second day he came and stood near me while I worked, and by the third day he asked me what I was doing when I was checking the horse's feet. I told him. He listened with his whole body, the way children do when they're truly interested, not performing interest. The girl was Nettie. She was 6 and she had her mother's eyes and a habit of standing half behind her mother's skirt even when there was nothing to be afraid of. She didn't come near me for the first week. I didn't push it. You don't push a thing like that. The littlest one was a girl too, not yet 2, and she had no real fear of anyone because she hadn't lived long enough to learn it. Her name was Ruth. She would crawl toward me when I sat near the fire and grab my finger with her whole fist and just hold it and look up at me with those dark, uncertain eyes, and I would sit very still so as not to frighten her. I don't know exactly when I decided. There wasn't a moment. It was more like the decision had already been made somewhere below thought, and what happened consciously was just me catching up to it. I went a crow feather. He was the person I said most things to that needed saying. We were sitting apart from the others, up on a slight rise where you could see the whole camp and the ridge beyond it. I said, I'm going to ask her. Crow Feather picked up a small stone and turned it in his fingers. He said, ask her what? I said to stay, to be my wife, to let me give her and her children a place. He was quiet a long time, then he said she is white. I said I know what she is. He said, there are people here who will say it's wrong, and there are people on her side who will say it's worse. I said I know that too. He turned the stone over again. He said, and what does she want? That was the question that mattered, and it was the one I didn't know the answer to. I went to her that evening. The children were asleep. She was sitting by the fire doing something with a piece of harness leather, working a tear in it with an awl she'd kept from the wagon, her hands steady and capable in a way that was good to watch. She heard me sit across from her, and she didn't stop working, just looked up once and then back down. I said what I had to say plainly. I wasn't a man for speeches. I told her that the weather would hold bad through March, maybe into April. I told her that the nearest settlement that would take her was 2 days east, and I had no reason to think it would be friendly. I told her I had ground, not by white law, not by any deed on paper, but by knowledge and use and what my people had kept for a generation, and that I had the means to provide through winter and beyond it. I told her that I was asking her to stay, not as a charity case, but as my wife, to take my name and let me take some of what she was carrying. She didn't say anything for a moment. She set the awl down and looked at the fire. She said, you don't know me. I said, I know enough. I know how you feed your children before yourself. I know you buried your husband alone in the frozen ground with a short-handled spade, and then you walked west because it was the only direction. I know you look at a man directly when most people look away. That's enough to know. She was quiet again. The fire shifted. One of the children made a sound in their sleep, and she looked that way automatically and then back. She said, I'm not a woman who needs saving. I said, I know. I'm not asking you because you need saving. I'm asking you because I've been alone 11 years and I'm tired of it, and you're someone worth not being alone with. That landed somewhere. I could see it land. She looked at me for a long time. She said, what would your people say? I said, some will say it's wrong. Most will say nothing if I say nothing about it first. She said, and the ones who say it's wrong? I said, they answer to me. She looked back at the fire. A long time passed and I didn't push it. You don't push a thing like that either. Then she said, I'll think on it. I said, take all the time you need. She thought on it for 3 days. I know because I was waiting, not anxiously, not in a way I showed, but I was aware of those 3 days the way you're aware of weather that hasn't broken yet. On the morning of the 3rd day, she came to where I was working and stood beside me and said, yes, if the offer stands. I said it stood. She said, I'll learn what I need to learn. I won't be useless to you. I said, I already know that. She held out her hand, the way a man might seal an agreement. I looked at it a moment and then I took it. Her grip was firm and her palm was rough from the spade and from however many miles she'd walked, and I held it and let it go. That was the beginning of the real part. She learned fast. That doesn't cover it. She learned the way a person learns who has decided to learn, which is different from someone going through motions. She watched the women in the camp without making them feel watched, which is a skill most people never develop. Inside of a month she could dress a kill without being shown twice, and she could read the weather in the sky the way I'd been doing for 20 years. Not perfectly, but well enough that she knew when I looked up what I was looking for. She learned the words she needed first, the ones for the children's names, for food, for danger, and she practiced them without embarrassment when she got them wrong. The children came with her, in their different ways. Thomas took to it the fastest, the way boys do when they're given a real thing to put their hands on. He followed Crow Feather's youngest son everywhere, and by April he was speaking in 2 languages without thinking about which one he was using, just reaching for the word that came first. Nettie was slower, but she was watching, always watching, storing it up. By summer she had built a friendship with a girl her own age in camp that was conducted mostly in gestures and then in fragments, and then in something that was almost fluency. Ruth didn't know the difference between languages. She just spoke at whoever was nearest. There was trouble. I told Crow Feather the truth I knew there would be. A man named Hears the Thunder was the loudest about it, not because he was wrong by his own lights, but because he had a way of making his own lights the only ones that counted. He made his objections to me directly, which I respected even if I didn't agree with him. I listened and I said, "She is my wife. I have decided." That was the end of the public argument. The private feeling took longer, but it took. On her side of it, there was a man from the settlement to the east, a cattle buyer named Foss, who came through in late March looking for stock. He saw Clara and he told her, with the flat, certain voice of a man who has never been told he's wrong, that she was making a mistake that couldn't be unmade, that she owed it to her children to come back to what he called civilization, that no white woman with any self-respect would do what she was doing. She looked at him with those brown eyes of hers and she said, "You don't know what I owe. Ride on." He rode on. I heard about it secondhand. She didn't tell me herself. She didn't need me to be proud of her for it, but I was. The first real spring was hard in a different way. The ground thawed and I showed her the place I had in mind, up the near slope of the ridge on the eastern end, sheltered from the worst wind, a spring that ran clean through July most years. Not a settlement, not a house with glass windows and a painted door. A place, solid and particular, that we would build from what was here. She stood on that ground and looked out over the valley below, and I watched her face and couldn't read it. She said, "There's room for a garden on the south side." I said, "There is." She said, "Thomas will need to know how to work the land as well as ride." I said, "I'll see to it." She turned and looked at me. She had a way of looking at me sometimes that I had to steady myself against. Not soft, she wasn't a soft woman, something else. Like she was taking me in fully and finding what was there. She said, "I made the right choice." I said, "I think so." She made a sound that was almost a laugh. She said, "I don't mean about the land." That hit me somewhere behind the ribs. I looked out at the valley and let a moment pass. I said, "Neither did I." We built through that spring and into summer. Not a white settlement's house, something between, something that was ours and not borrowed from either side. The children helped in the ways children help, which is to say they were more trouble than assistance and completely necessary. Thomas became useful by July in a real way, not just fetching and carrying but thinking. He had a mechanical mind, the kind that looks at a problem and wants to solve it through the problem's own logic. It was good to see. Nettie planted the garden and defended it against the deer with a ferocity that made the men in camp laugh and say she would be a great warrior. Ruth walked everywhere and got into everything and laughed at things none of us could identify. The camp accepted Clara the way camps accept things that work. Not warmly, at first, But there is a practical honesty in a life that can't afford to waste things, and Clara worked and contributed and did not make herself small for anyone. And by the end of the summer, it was simply true that she belonged there in the way that things which work always come to belong. Here's the Thunder's wife, a woman named Standing Elk who watches, had been cool to Clara for months, polite in the way that contains nothing. Then in August, one of Standing Elk's grandchildren took sick, a fever, dangerous, the kind that goes either way by the third day. Clara had some knowledge of it from her own childhood, from something her mother had told her and she'd kept. She sat with that child through the worst of the night, and did what she knew, and by morning the fever had broken. Standing Elk who watches brought Clara a pair of moccasins she had made herself, worked with quill work on the toe, and set them down without a word. Clara put them on. That was all, but something shifted after that and didn't shift back. In the fall of that year there was a delegation from a territorial office, 2 men with papers and the manner of men who have decided things without being asked. They wanted to know about the white woman living with the Lakota band and whether she was there willingly and whether the children were safe. I spoke with them. I was not angry, though the questions offended me. I was patient and direct. Clara came and stood beside me and answered their questions herself in the flat, honest way she answered everything. The men looked at each other and looked at the children playing in the distance and went away. They didn't come back. After they were gone, she stayed standing there beside me. The sun was getting low, and it put the light on the side of her face and on her hair, and Thomas was yelling something at his sister somewhere out of sight, the ordinary sound of children, and she sighed once and her shoulder came against mine and stayed there. I didn't move. She said, "Thank you for not sending me away." I said I never would have. She said, "I know, I wanted to say it anyway." I put my arm around her and she leaned into me the way a person leans when they've decided to let someone hold some of the weight. I held it. It was not a small thing, and she knew it wasn't, and I knew it wasn't, and neither of us needed to say so. That winter was mild, or maybe I just remember it as mild. I will tell you this, I had not expected anything after my wife and son. Not because I'd given up exactly. More like I'd become someone whose life was the work and the people and the responsibility, and there wasn't a shape for anything else anymore. When you carry a thing for 11 years, you stop imagining putting it down. The stone in you stops being a stone you carry and starts being just a part of how you're built. She put it down. Not in a single moment and not with anything said about it. Just over the months, the weight of what I'd been carrying for 11 years got lighter without me trying. That's the only way I know how to say it. I'd look at Thomas showing Crow Feather's son something with a piece of wire, and I'd look at the garden going brown at the end of summer, and at Ruth asleep with her face pressed against my knee, and at Clara standing in the door of what we'd built with the last light on her. And the stone just wasn't there the way it used to be. She didn't save me the way a person pulls someone from a river. It wasn't like that. It was quieter. It was just her choosing to be there, every day, choosing it again, and eventually the weight of 11 years of choosing alone didn't need to be mine to carry anymore. Second winter. We had 4 walls and a proper roof by then, and enough laid in for the season. The children were settled in the way children settle when they've been somewhere long enough to know where everything is. Thomas had a horse, a brown and white paint that Crow Feather's family had given him, and he was already a better rider than most boys his age. Nettie had made enough progress in the language that she could carry on a real conversation with the older women in camp, and she preferred their company to almost anyone else's, which made the older women proud in that understated way of people who have seen enough to know what's worth being proud of. Ruth spoke whatever she felt like speaking in whatever language it came to her in, and everyone understood her anyway. Clara had learned to shoot properly. She hadn't asked me to teach her. She asked Crow Feather, which I found out about afterward, and he had taught her on a bet. She'd wagered that she could outshoot him inside of a month, which she couldn't. But she could outshoot most men in camp by the end of the 2nd month, and Crow Feather told everyone about it with the slightly aggrieved pride of a teacher whose student has exceeded reasonable expectations. That winter there was a stretch of cold that pushed down from the north, hard cold, the kind that finds the gaps in everything. 6 days of it, the temperature staying below what most creatures want to stay alive in. I was out each morning checking on the livestock and the horses and the older members of the camp, covering the distances that needed covering, and one evening I came in cold enough that I couldn't quite get the cold out of my hands even near the fire. Clara noticed. She came and sat beside me and took my hands in both of hers without asking, just took them, and held them until the warmth came back. She didn't say anything about it, I didn't either. But she kept holding my hands longer than the cold required, and her head came down to my shoulder, and I looked at the fire and at the ice on the inside of the window, and at Thomas asleep across the room with one arm hanging off his pallet, and I thought, this is what I built. This is what I held the ground for. This is what all the years of carrying and deciding, and being the one who knew where the water ran under the ice were for. Not a thought, I said, just a thought I had. There is a thing a man learns if he lives long enough and pays attention, that being needed is not the same as being chosen. I had been needed most of my life. The band needed me to know where the game was and which ridges cut the wind and when to move and when to hold. I'd spent 20 years being the man who knew things other people needed to know. That's not nothing. That's its own weight and its own reward. But chosen is different. Chosen means someone looked and saw and decided, chose freely and without being required to. That's what she'd done. She hadn't needed to take my name. She hadn't needed to stay. She was 19 and capable, and she would have found some other road eventually. She took mine because she decided I was worth taking it. I didn't think about that word often, worth, but I thought about it sometimes at night when the camp was quiet, and I could hear the horses shifting in the dark and Clara's breathing beside me, even and steady, and the children arranged around us in the particular disorder of children who have stopped being afraid. Worth, 41 years old and a dead wife and 11 years of stone in the chest, and then this. A 19-year-old woman with a direct gaze and cracked lips and 3 children and a short-handled spade, and enough spine for a woman twice her age. She came out of February and she looked at me and she decided. I think about that. 3rd year. The garden was twice the size it had been the first spring, and Thomas had taken a primary role in it, which no one including Thomas had predicted. He had the patience for it, the willingness to wait on a thing and trust it. He was 8 by then and already taller than his mother. He and Crow Feather were close in the way of a boy and an older man who have found in each other exactly what the other needed to give. That was good to watch too. A preacher came through in the spring of the 3rd year, traveling west with a family of settlers. He stopped at the camp the way travelers did, and I fed him and gave him a night's shelter, which is what you do. In the morning he asked Clara, meaning kindly, whether she wished to speak with him about her situation. She said her situation was fine. He looked at the camp and at the children and at me, and he said, God's grace is available to any who seek it, ma'am, whatever errors the past has brought. Clara looked at him with those level brown eyes. She said, I'm not seeking anything. Everything I have I chose. Thank you for the concern. The preacher went on west. He shook my hand before he left, to his credit. Some didn't. That evening Nettie told us what she'd overheard, which she'd understood because by now she understood most things. She was 9 and she wanted to know what errors the preacher meant. Clara said, he doesn't know us. He sees a shape he recognizes and he names it without looking closer. That's his way. Ours is different. Nettie thought about that. She said he seemed kind. Clara said he was. Kind and wrong at the same time. It happens. Ruth, who was 4 and therefore unable to let a conversation not involve her, said, What's an error? Thomas said, It's when you're wrong about something. Ruth said, Am I wrong about something? Clara said, Not that I know of. Ruth said, Good, and went back to what she was doing. I didn't say anything, but I looked at Clara across the fire and she looked back, and there was something in that look that would be hard to put words to. Recognition, maybe. The kind between two people who have built something together and know what it took. There is one more thing I want to tell you. 4 years in, late summer. I was up on the ridge by myself before the light, the way I went most mornings when I needed to think without interruption. The valley below was still gray, and the mist was sitting in the low places, and it was quiet in the way that early morning is quiet before anything has started. I was thinking about nothing in particular, the way you do when things are right enough that your mind doesn't need to chew on anything. I heard her coming up the slope before I saw her. She moved quietly, but not as quietly as she thought she did, and I smiled into the gray light before she was there. She came and sat beside me, close enough that our arms touched, and looked out at the same valley. She said, "You're up early." I said, "So are you." She said, "Couldn't sleep, I kept thinking." I said, "About what?" She said, "About how I used to be terrified of this. All of it. The plains and the cold and what would happen to them if something happened to me, and how I'm not anymore." I looked out at the valley. I said, "What changed?" She turned and looked at me. The light was coming now, slow and flat from the east, and it came onto her face and onto the gray in her hair that had been coming in since the second year, and her eyes were direct and plain the way they'd been the first morning, in the snow, when she told me she didn't want charity. She said, "You did. I knew I wasn't alone." I didn't say anything. The valley lightened. The mist started moving in the first small breath of wind, and below us I could hear the camp beginning, the first sounds of morning, the particular life of people who belong to a place. She put her hand on mine. I turned mine over and held it. We sat like that until the light was full. Didn't need to say anything else. The valley was there, and the mist was burning off the low places, and below us the children were waking up and the horses were moving and Crow Feather would be building the fire, and the day would come the way the day comes. I had given her ground and my name. She had given me back the 11 years I'd thought were gone. That's the trade. I'd make it every time,